Today I just want to talk to you about reading out Palmetto. You know, how to look at a Palmetto trunk and get an idea of its history just from looking at it. This right here is probably a 30 plus foot tall Palmetto. That's a big one. And as you can see from the trunk, it's a fairly consistent diameter the entire way up, which tells you that this Palmetto has been out in the open, growing in good conditions its entire life. You can see down here from the buttress, it had a little bit of damage, probably from fire, maybe from farm equipment. Definitely fire, I can see burn marks there. But it's been doing pretty good almost its entire life. And you can read a lot from the trunk of a Palmetto. However, you can't read much from one like this that has a full suite of boots. And a boot is what's left over of the frond after the leaf dies. And by comparison, here's about a 20-foot tall Palmetto. And this one's got some variation in it, but it's more subtle. As you can see down here at the bottom, it starts out very thick. Very nice, very healthy. It had great growing conditions, probably a clear canopy. And then right about there, the trunk starts to narrow, and then it stays narrow up until about there. And then it widens out again, and then it starts to narrow and bend. And that tells you that right about there, something started shading out this Palmetto, and it grew up very quickly with a very narrow trunk until it got to there, and widened back out, narrowed again, widened back out, narrowed again, and it's got a fairly small crown right now. And that's likely these pine trees right here blocking out a lot of its light. And again, this one over here, you can see it right at the bottom. You've got a regular sized buttress. It narrows very quickly, and then it broadens super fast. It gets real thick and beefy, and then it starts to thin out a bit. Then it widens, and then it thins, and it's thinning all the way up at the top. Once again, probably these pines here. It started out a regular size. It got really heavy shade at one point, maybe a tree fell on it, and then right after that it had beautiful growing conditions for probably a decade. And I'll show you some more extreme examples and some transplants as well, to really emphasize how much you can read from a Palmetto just looking at its trunk. Also, here's a fairly young Palmetto, and as you can see, it's just starting to build a trunk. And they don't really build a trunk until they get about this size. They grow and grow and grow until they reach, the size of a regular Palmetto crown, and then instead of growing outward, they grow upward. And after that point, Palmettos don't grow any wider. They just grow straight up. But when they're young, they do grow outward. They build their bud wider and wider and wider, and they just take off. Then the root system builds along with them into a big old ball underground. But until they're about this size, they're not forming a trunk. See, like this guy right here, he's not forming a trunk. That guy, just starting. Those over there, nothing. Those, just starting. And right here, this is probably a 25 to 30 foot Palmetto here, but it's a perfect example of a Palmetto that started out in a really good position. Probably was a very young tree right when this forest was last logged, at least this area right here. She started out really strong, really thick, getting a lot of sun, a lot of moisture, and as it grows, it narrows and narrows and narrows and narrows and narrows and narrows until it's an absolute little spindle up there at the top, and a far cry from the, nearly 18-inch diameter at the bottom of the buttress. You can also notice here at the crown, you see how long it is, how much room there is between each boot, and the fact that the boots point upward. Well, that's a result of it, rather than growing that wide but that tall, growing that wide but, that tall per year. Each time it puts out a boot, it puts out, it's putting out the same amount of volume of trunk, maybe a little less, but it's putting it all into height rather than into girth because it's trying to get the sunlight. But unlucky for it, it's growing right next to a live oak, which is also trying to do the very same thing. And they have similar life histories, but live oaks get a lot bigger. So it's slowly getting choked off, and unless something happens like this water oak dying, it's probably going to get snuffed out in another decade or so, or blown over. Here's another one nearby that's in even worse condition. It's probably only 13 to 15 foot tall, and as you can see, it rose up and narrows and narrows and narrows. Took some kind of crown damage there. Maybe it had a tree fall on it. Who knows? And then it's sort of working around that, and done got long left. Right here, this is a totally different beast. This is the Hammock Island Palmetto, which is just what I've dubbed these sorry little palmettos that have the misfortune of growing somewhere just above the mean high water line, but not below the mean high water line, and they end up seriously stunted. They get a good decade or so. They put some height on them, and then they get a couple of storm surges, and the sea level rises, or the currents in the channel change, and the mean high water goes up just a little bit, and they waste away. Now here we have a nice, healthy looking, very straight, very even, very clean palmetto. And this one was transplanted before it reached, that full crown height I was talking about. When it was still in the bush stage, it got moved over here. And it sat there for probably 10 years before it finally got large enough and grew up. And that was dug up down in Botany Bay by, I think, my uncle. And they brought it here, and I was told it was here for probably 10 years before it started growing. Before my great uncle backed into it with a truck. It just happened to be the time it started growing. And then over here we have a tree that is the same size, same girth, same crown height, maybe 2 or 3 feet shorter. But you notice right there in the middle, there is a very clear, very obvious hourglass. Right, yeah. And if you notice down at the bottom, it's one diameter, then it hourglasses, then it balloons up, and then it gets thicker. And that is characteristic of a transplant tree. This tree was moved when it was that tall. When it was only about 5 feet tall, this tree got dug up and moved here. And when they did that, they totally messed up and disturbed the root system, which caused the tree to lose its ability to access water and nutrients and stunted its growth, which caused it to narrow in like this as it spent a year regrowing its entire root system. Then it took it probably another year, maybe 2 years, to recover. So it got transplanted here, then it narrowed, then it expanded, and now that it's in a completely different environment, completely different soil, completely different light conditions, completely different soil chemistry, irrigation regime, available soil moisture, that changes its ability to grow. And that, in turn, changes the diameter of the trunk of the tree from that point on. So this is the diameter the tree was able to put on every year in its original location. Then it was transplanted, and then after that, since the growing conditions were totally different in the new site, it changed the rate it grew. As you can see here, this tree had plenty of light, plenty of access to water and nutrients, and as a result, it started growing less each year, and it started putting out more width. So you see how close these scars here are, and that's where the boots of previous years attached on these scars. And you see down here, although it's much older, the gaps between the scars are much farther apart. Whereas up here, they're very close together. So there's a lot you can learn about the life story of a palmetto just from reading the trunk, whether or not, as you saw before, there were significant changes in the growing conditions and the amount of available light, maybe soil salinity, soil water, whether or not it was transplanted, whether or not something tragic happened to it. Now, as another comparison, here is a palmetto that my grandmother planted from seed probably in the early 50s, mid 50s, maybe even the early 60s. And it's huge. That's a big palmetto. That's like a 20-inch tree. And it's 25 foot tall. And it's only 60 to 70 years old. It's probably not much older than that tree right there, but it is humongous. And as you notice, the growth has been incredibly consistent the entire time. From looking at the growth rings and the diameter of the tree, it has been growing at the same rate that entire time, just with that massive girth. And the reason for that is because the septic drain field runs right there. So this tree has been irrigated with poo water its entire life. And the soil out here on what my grandma called the anthill is incredibly sandy, super high in phosphorus, and what it's really lacking is potassium and nitrogen. And you know what P is full of? You guessed it, potassium and nitrogen. So this tree has been growing like gangbusters for as long as the house has been here. Yeah, she planted that magnolia too at the same time, and there's like a 30-inch magnolia right there. She planted that live oak too, which is like a 4-foot live oak. We can't grow any crops here on the anthill, but we can grow trees like a son of a bitch. So anyway, that's how you read your palmettos. How you can figure out when your palmetto was transplanted, if it was transplanted, what its health is, whether or not it needs more light or not. Ideally, what you want to see is that. That's a beautiful palmetto right there. But something like that's not bad either. Something like this shows a successful transplant. Not much went wrong there. It only narrowed a little bit for a very short time. What you don't want to see is a palmetto that's very heavy at the bottom, and then like those ones I showed you in the woods, it narrows real fast, or it gets real skinny in the middle at one point, and then stays skinny. That's a bad sign. Trees in parking lots are notorious for looking like that, for having a really heavy hourglass and just looking terrible in general. And that's just because palmettos are excellent urban landscape trees here in Charleston. And they get overused. People put them everywhere, literally everywhere. They do the same thing with live oaks and crepe myrtles. But I'm telling you, crepe myrtles and palmettos can take it. They do not care. They'll grow anywhere. But the problem is landscapers get carried away, and when they plant palmettos, they don't irrigate them. They prop them up, but they don't irrigate them, and they need to be irrigated not in the first 6 months, because after they're transplanted, the root system is destroyed, and they're actually living off of the water in their trunk. But once they start putting out new roots, they need to be irrigated. As soon as they start growing again, they need to have some amount of water, just to be able to build up those roots. And if they don't get that water, they croak, or they get a really severe hourglass. So ideally you want to put them someplace, and you want to supply them with just enough water that they can trickle feed their new roots until they get a root system established. And then they need absolutely no care at all. And I mean no care. You don't got to prune them, don't got to do nothing. We don't do anything here except pull the fronds out of the tree when they start getting a little too dangly. And they just love it. I mean, and those flowers, when your palmettos put out flowers, that means they're healthy. If your palmettos are not flowering, you're doing something wrong. So now you know a little bit more about the history of your palmetto. So get out there, go look at them, and figure out where it's been, what it's doing, where it's going, and whether or not it needs anything. Till next time, time out. You might be wondering why I know so much about the life history of palmettos. And that's because I studied a species of beetle, Zagmus clarinus, that bores inside of palmetto boots. And as you can see there, that's similar to their emergence hole, but that's not one of them. And when I was studying them, in order to try and determine whether or not they were getting moved around via transplanted palmettos, what I would do is I would find palmettos that still had the boots on them, but exhibited those signs of the hourglass. And the way you can tell when it has the boots on it is you'll see a radical change in the angle of the boots on the tree. You know, like down here, the boots would be growing like this. And then all of a sudden, the boots go like this. And so the boots just change direction in the middle of the trunk. Their angle is shifted, and that indicates where there was an hourglass, where there was a narrowing or an expansion. And if there's like a significant expansion like that, you'll also see it. I mean, the tree will just look wider. And what I was doing in this, I was going around looking at transplant trees that still had boots on them. And what I was looking for was signs of Zagmus clarinus below the hourglass, but not above. Because if it showed signs of the beetle activity on the boots that existed below the hourglass, but before it was transplanted, then that indicates that they existed wherever the tree was taken from. But if they weren't above it, that indicates that the beetles died out whenever the tree was transplanted and they didn't establish. But if you came out and you found, you know, old nasty emergence holes down here and fresh new ones all the way up there, you knew they were there when the tree was moved, and they're still there, you know, or vice versa. If you went out here and you saw nothing below the transplant, and then you saw them above the transplant, you knew they were where the tree was planted, but they weren't where the tree came from.